Picture this. It is the 10th of December, 1718. Charleston, in the young colony of South Carolina. A cold wind is coming off the harbor, and the tide is running out, exposing the black mud of the marsh below the gallows. A man is standing on the scaffold in a fine coat. His hair, still powdered, is falling in loose strands over his eyes. In his bound hands, he is holding a small bouquet of flowers. Some in the crowd say he is weeping. Others say he is speaking to himself, or perhaps to God. His name is Stede Bonnet. Just 18 months ago, he was a wealthy sugar planter on the island of Barbados, a major in the local militia, a husband, a father of 4. He owned around 400 acres of cane and a substantial house. He had never spent a single night on a ship of war. He had never fired a naval gun in anger. He had certainly never killed a man. Now, the sheriff is placing the noose around his neck. How does a gentleman like this end up on a rope in a colonial harbour? How does the son of Barbadian aristocracy become the man history remembers as the gentleman pirate? A phrase that sounds almost like a joke, until you look at what he actually did. And, more troublingly, how much of the story you think you know about Stede Bonnet is history, and how much is a legend that was already being written before his body was cut down and buried in the mud? Because there are 2 Stede Bonnets. There is the one the pamphleteers and the novelists, and now the television writers, have given us the mild, refined, slightly ridiculous man who ran away to sea to escape a nagging wife. And then there is the one who appears in the trial transcripts of a hanging judge named Nicholas Trott. Tonight, we are going to try to tell them apart. To understand how Stede Bonnet became possible, you have to understand the world that had just ended. For over a decade, from 1701 to 1714, Europe had been consumed by the War of the Spanish Succession. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and their allies had fought France and Spain across 2 continents and every ocean. In the Caribbean, that war had been fought largely by privateers, private ship captains, licensed by their governments, paid in prizes taken from enemy merchants. For over a decade, the West Indies had swarmed with these men. Some grew rich, most did not. When the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1713, that entire economy collapsed overnight. Thousands of hardened sailors, most of them experienced in violence at sea, were suddenly unemployed. Their letters of marque were void, their skills were unwanted, and the merchant navies were paying half of what they had earned as privateers, if they were paying at all. So they did what men in that position have always done. They kept doing what they knew how to do, only now without a license. In the Bahamas, on the island of New Providence, hundreds of these former privateers gathered in the town of Nassau. There was no functioning royal government. There was a harbour deep enough for their small sloops, but too shallow for the Royal Navy's ships of the line. And there was open water in every direction, filled with fat, slow merchantmen carrying sugar, rum, tobacco, and gold. Nassau became something close to an independent republic, a place where men like Benjamin Hornigold, Charles Vane, and a former privateer's mate named Edward Thatch, whom the world would come to call Blackbeard, held court. This is the world historians now call the Golden Age of piracy, and in 1716 and 1717, at the very peak of it, a plantation owner in Barbados began quietly making arrangements that would take him from his family drawing room to the gallows in about 20 months. Barbados itself, at that moment, was one of the richest small places in the entire British Empire. Its economy rested on sugarcane, and its sugarcane rested on the forced labour of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans. Bridgetown, its capital, was a boom town of merchants, planters, and Royal Navy officers, all of them enriched by the same sweet, brutal system. It was the kind of colony where a gentleman with 400 acres and a militia commission was, by definition, a man of standing. To leave it voluntarily was almost incomprehensible, which is exactly what Stede Bonnet was about to do. Stede Bonnet was baptized on the 29th of July, 1688, at Christchurch Parish, Barbados. His family had been on the island for 2 generations. When his father died in 1694, Stede inherited an estate of around 400 acres, largely planted with sugarcane. He was 6 years old. By his late 20s, he had done everything a Barbadian gentleman was expected to do. He had been educated. He had learned the management of the plantation and its enslaved workers. Because we should not pretend otherwise. This was the source of his fortune and its horror. He had received a commission as a major in the local militia, though he never appears to have seen combat. In 1709, he married Mary Allenby. Together they had at least 4 children. One of them, a son named Allenby, died in early childhood. And then, sometime in the late spring or early summer of 1717, at the age of 29, Stede Bonnet did something that no one in his class was supposed to do. He walked into a Bridgetown shipyard, and he bought a ship. This alone should stop us. Pirates did not buy ships. Pirates stole them. That was, in a very literal sense, the entire business model. Almost every famous pirate captain of the Golden Age acquired his vessel through mutiny or capture. Bonnet paid cash for his, a 60-ton sloop with 10 mounted guns, rigged for speed, built for the shallow coastal waters of the Americas. He named her the Revenge, which is either a rather poetic name for a ship no one had yet wronged, or a clue about the man's inner state. He recruited about 70 men in Bridgetown, and here he made his second unheard-of decision. He announced that he would pay them wages, in cash, every month. To understand how strange this is, you have to know that Golden Age pirate crews operated as rough shareholders, democracies. Every man aboard signed articles specifying his share of any prize. The captain got maybe 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, everyone else 1. There was no salary because there was no employer. The ship was, in effect, a joint venture. Bonnet, the plantation owner, could not seem to imagine any other way of running a workforce. He treated his crew as employees, and when the prizes came, or did not come, this would matter. By the late summer of 1717, the Revenge was slipping out of Bridgetown harbour at night. Bonnet, historians agree, told his family and his neighbours that he was making a legitimate voyage. Then he sailed north, toward the Virginia Capes. And there he became, for the first time in his life, a pirate. Why he did it, that is the question no one has ever fully answered. Contemporary rumour, which Captain Charles Johnson would later polish into legend, blamed an unhappy marriage. Modern historians have pointed to other possibilities. The death of his young son Allenby, only a few years earlier. The pressures of debt on a Barbados sugar economy that was, beneath its glitter, showing early cracks. A midlife crisis of a kind our own century would recognise, or something more clinical, hinted at by a phrase Johnson used and later readers seized on. Some genuine disorder of the mind. We do not know. What we know is that the man who sailed out of Bridgetown was walking away from everything a person of his standing was supposed to want, and that he was walking on some level toward the noose. The first months went as well as an amateur pirate's first months can go. Off the Virginia and Carolina coasts, in the autumn of 1717, the Revenge took several merchant ships. Bonnet plundered them of sugar, provisions, rigging, and a few coins. He burned one of them, the turbot, apparently because it was from his own Barbados, a detail that has fascinated historians ever since. Was it to conceal his identity, or was it something more personal? Then, sailing south again, Bonnet made a mistake that nearly killed him. He engaged a Spanish man of war, thinking it was a merchantman. The fight was a slaughter. Half his crew was killed or wounded. Bonnet himself was badly hurt. The Revenge, its rigging shot to pieces, limped into Nassau to refit. And that is where he met Edward Thatch. Blackbeard was at that point, at the height of his powers. He had recently taken command of a captured French slaver, which he had renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge, and mounted with 40 guns, a floating fortress compared to Bonnet's sloop. He was surrounded by hardened men. And instead Bonnet, wounded, embarrassed, and hopelessly out of his depth, he saw an opportunity. The arrangement, on paper, was a partnership. Blackbeard offered to command the Revenge personally, while Bonnet, quote, recovered his health aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. In practice, Bonnet was politely removed from his own ship. He became a passenger. Some contemporary accounts suggest he was, in effect, a prisoner, though he still had his personal cabin and his books. Together, this fleet of 4 vessels moved on Charleston. In May of 1718, they blockaded the harbour for nearly a week, stopping every ship going in or out. They took hostages, among them a member of the governor's own council, Samuel Wragg, and his 4-year-old son. They sent a messenger ashore with a demand, not for gold, but for a chest of medicines. Historians still argue over exactly what condition on board required it. Mercury for venereal disease is one long-standing theory. Whatever the reason, Charleston paid. The chest was delivered. The hostages, eventually, were released, half-naked and terrified. It was one of the most brazen acts of piracy in American history, conducted almost within sight of the town. Then, a few weeks later, everything fell apart. In early June of 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground on a sandbar at Topsail Inlet, on the coast of what is now North Carolina. There is a strong argument, put forward by scholars including Colin Woodard, that Blackbeard grounded her deliberately, to reduce his crew's size and their claim on the shared plunder. Whatever the truth, the effect was clear. Blackbeard took the best men and the best of the treasure, marooned others on a nearby sandbar, and sailed away in a smaller vessel. Stede Bonnet, once more in command of the Revenge, went inland to the town of Bath, in North Carolina, to seek a royal pardon from the colony's governor, Charles Eden. He received it, and for a moment, just a moment, Stede Bonnet was a free man, a pardoned pirate, with his ship, his life, and the possibility of going home. He did not go home. Instead, within weeks, he was at sea again. He renamed the Revenge the Royal James, a Jacobite name, hinting at loyalties to the exiled Stuart claimant to the British throne, which may or may not have been genuine. He called himself Captain Thomas, and he began attacking merchant shipping again along the Carolina coast. He was, by every measure, doomed. Before we come to the end, we need to talk about the story you have probably heard. If you have encountered Stede Bonnet before, there is a strong chance it was through a recent television series that reimagines him as a gentle, hapless soul who runs off to sea in the middle of an existential crisis, or through popular history books that call him, always with a smile, the gentleman pirate. In both, the picture is roughly the same. Bonnet is bookish. He carries a library aboard his ship. He is bored, kind, a little ridiculous. He flees a nagging wife. He plays at piracy without really understanding it. Almost all of that picture comes, ultimately, from a single source. 6 years after Bonnet's death, in 1724, a book appeared in London under the name of Captain Charles Johnson, titled A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates. Whoever Johnson actually was, his identity is still debated. His book became the foundation of everything we think we know about Golden Age piracy. He gave us the beard woven with slow matches. He gave us the black flag with the skull. And he gave us the phrase that follows Bonnet through history, that he took to the sea because of what Johnson called some discomposure of mind, thought to have been caused by an uneasy state with his wife. This is where the myth is born. A gentleman driven to piracy by domestic unhappiness. It is a story out of a stage comedy, and there is almost no independent evidence for any of it. Turn instead to the trial records, published in 1719 by the man who ran the trial, Vice Admiralty Judge Nicholas Trott of South Carolina, and a very different Stede Bonnet appears. In those records, witnesses describe how Bonnet's crew treated captured sailors. They describe prisoners beaten, men threatened with death, men forced to work the pumps of prizes while their captors mocked them. They describe killings. Bonnet was formally indicted on 2 counts of piracy. Those were sufficient, but the evidence introduced against him and his men covered at least 13 separate captures across the Carolina coast. The man who commanded the ships that did these things was not on the page of the trial transcript. a bookish eccentric. He was a small-time warlord. Here I want to pause. Everything you are hearing tonight is drawn from surviving court records, colonial correspondence, and the small library of serious scholarship on the golden age of piracy. If you want the primary documents, Trott's charge to the jury, the Barbados baptismal record, the deposition of William Rhett, and a full timeline of the Revenge's voyages, I have compiled all of them, with notes, into a free document called the Black Flag Codex. The link is in the description, and the QR code is on your screen now. It is the working notebook behind this channel, and I keep expanding it. Now, back to the hunt. The governor of South Carolina, Robert Johnson, had had enough. In September of 1718, he commissioned Colonel William Rhett, a wealthy Charleston merchant with a militia commission and a taste for adventure, to hunt Bonnet down. Rhett fitted out 2 sloops, the Henry and the Sea Nymph, with about 130 men between them, and sailed for the Cape Fear River, where Bonnet's Royal James had been reported careening. They found him on the 27th of September, 1718. The battle that followed lasted between 5 and 6 hours. It was fought in the narrow mouth of the river, at low tide. Both sides ran aground on opposing sandbars, unable to maneuver, and simply blazed at each other with their guns at close range. Casualties diverge across the surviving accounts. Some sources put the pirate losses at 7 killed and 5 wounded against 10 of Rhett's men killed and 14 wounded. Others count closer to a dozen dead on each side. Whatever the exact numbers, when the tide finally turned, Rhett's sloops floated free first. Bonnet's did not. Facing point-blank fire from a refloated enemy, and with his own gunner refusing to blow up the powder magazine as ordered, he surrendered. He was brought to Charleston in chains. Nicholas Trott was not an ordinary judge. He was one of the most learned men in the American colonies, a compiler of the laws of South Carolina, a serious biblical scholar, and a fervent Anglican. He had also, over his career, developed a genuine loathing for pirates, whom he regarded as enemies of civilized commerce and enemies of God. He was exactly the wrong man to be judged by, if you were Stede Bonnet. The Vice Admiralty Court in Charleston opened proceedings against Bonnet's crew on the 28th of October, 1718. Bonnet, at that moment, was not in his cell. 4 nights earlier, on the 24th, he had done something extraordinary. He had escaped. Because of his rank, he had not been held with the crew in the town watchhouse. He had been kept under guard at the Provost Marshal's residence, along with his sailing master David Heriot and his boatswain Ignatius Pell. On the night of the 24th, with the reported help of 2 enslaved men and a Native American who wanted to join a pirate crew, Bonnet and Heriot slipped away. Contemporary accounts differ on the details of their disguise. The popular version, from Johnson, has them dressed in women's clothes. What is certain is that they made it out of the town by boat and ended up on Sullivan's Island at the mouth of the harbour. A posse tracked them there. Heriot was shot dead in the recapture. Bonnet was taken alive on the 5th of November and returned to Charleston the next day, this time to a proper cell. His own trial opened on the 10th of November, ran through the 11th, and reached its verdict on the 12th. His defence was straightforward. He argued that Blackbeard had forced him into piracy, that the pardon he had received in North Carolina absolved his earlier crimes, and that his later attacks had been for provisioning only, not for gain. He even claimed, at one point, to have been asleep in his cabin while his crew took one of the prizes. Witness after witness demolished each of these claims. Members of his own crew testified that he had led the attacks freely, that prisoners had been beaten on his orders, that the plunder had been shared out in the conventional way. He was convicted of the first count. Facing an almost identical second trial, he asked the court's permission to change his plea to guilty on that charge as well. Then, Nicholas Trott stood up to deliver the sentence. The speech that followed, which was published in full in London the following year, ran to many thousands of words. It is one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire Golden Age. Trott did not merely condemn Bonnet. He preached to him. He moved through passage after passage of Scripture, from the Old Testament and from the New, and he told Bonnet that piracy was not simply a crime against the king's law, but a rebellion against God. He compared him to Cain. He warned him, in words the transcript preserved, that he faced not only physical death, but everlasting burning in fire and brimstone. And then, remarkably, he begged him to repent before the noose, so that his soul might yet be saved, even if his body could not. Trott ended, remarkably, not with anger, but with a kind of pastoral care. He assured Bonnet, in the same speech that condemned him to death, that the mercy of Christ was still available to him, that the thief on the cross had entered paradise, and that so, still, could Stede Bonnet, if he would repent and believe. It is one of the strangest documents in early American law, a judge who has just ordered a man's death spending pages trying to save his soul. Bonnet, in his cell over the following weeks, wrote long, pleading letters to Governor Johnson, begging for mercy. He offered to have his arms and legs cut off if only he might live. He offered to become an indentured servant, in perpetuity, in any colony the governor named. He referred to himself, humiliatingly, in the third person, the miserable prisoner. There is real terror in these letters, and a real breaking down of the man of standing he had once been. None of this was granted. On the 10th of December, 1718, he was taken from the town watchhouse and walked to White Point, on the southern tip of the Charleston Peninsula, where the harbour and the marsh meet. There was a scaffold there, low over the tidal flats. A crowd had gathered. Charles Johnson would later write that Bonnet held a bouquet of flowers in his bound hands. It is one of the details that has done the most to preserve his gentle image. Whether it is true, we cannot know. He was hanged. His body was cut down and buried below the low water mark, in the mud, the traditional disgrace for a convicted pirate. Today, that spot is a public park called the Battery. Families walk their dogs there. Almost no one who visits knows, so what should we make of Stede Bonnet? The temptation, especially now, is to take the tender version, the bookish gentleman with his library, running from an unhappy marriage, hopelessly outmatched by the sea and by the men around him. He is a much more comfortable figure than the alternative. He is a figure we can laugh at, sympathize with, project ourselves onto. He is the pirate we would be if any of us were ever brave enough or foolish enough to try. But if we are serious about history, and everything on this channel begins with that promise, then we have to also hold the other Bonnet, the one who ordered a ship burned, the one whose crew brutalized prisoners, the one who broke a royal pardon and returned to attacks that got men killed on both sides, the one who, in his final letters, would have done almost anything to save himself. He was not a monster on the scale of Blackbeard or Vane, but he was not gentle either. He was, in the end, a man who tried on a role he did not understand, and who could not get out of it, and who kept doing damage until someone else stopped him. The truth is that both Bonnets are real. There is a real gentleman here, a man raised in every advantage his colony could offer, whose letters show real education, whose surrender came in part because his ideas of honour would not let him do otherwise. And there is a real pirate here, because the moment he raised a black flag off the Virginia Capes, the moment he ordered the first prize taken, everything else he had been became beside the point. The legend of the gentleman pirate is a way of not looking at that. It is a way of turning a moral catastrophe into a costume drama, and it has been doing that work since Captain Johnson's book appeared in 1724, only 6 years after the tide came in over Stede Bonnet's grave. The line runs from Johnson straight through the swashbuckling romances of the 19th century, through Byron's poem The Corsair, through the Errol Flynn films, through Pirates of the Caribbean, and now into the tender comedies of streaming television. Each generation gets the pirate it needs. Ours, apparently, needs a wounded, gentle man in ruffles. It is a beautiful image. It is not, quite, the man who was hanged at White Point. Before we close, one last note. The primary documents for this story, the trial records, Trott's sermon, the Barbados Parish Register, the accounts of the Cape Fear battle, are almost all available. If you want to read them yourselves, the annotated links are gathered in the Black Flag Codex, free in the description below. It is the best way to hear these men in their own voices, and to make up your own mind about which bonnet was closer to the truth. The tide still comes in and out at White Point Garden, as it has for 3 centuries. The oaks that shade the park are strung with Spanish moss. On a still evening, when the pleasure boats have gone in and the wind has dropped, you can stand on the seawall and hear the water lapping against the stones just below. Somewhere down there, deep in the mud where the marsh once was, are the bones of a man who was born to sugar and to gentility, and who chose, for reasons no one has ever fully explained, to go out onto the water in a ship he had bought with his own money, flying a flag he had had made in his own drawing room, at the head of a crew he paid in silver. He lasted, from the day the Revenge left Bridgetown to the day the Noose closed at Charleston, a little over 15 months. The sea does not remember him, but we, perhaps, still can.